Goku and Vegeta. I think a lot of people would say two of the worst dads in film.
Why would you ever want to steal the nine tails inside of your own son? Do you have any idea what I went through because you did that?
This is what you did to me. And the pain that you gave me was a result of what you couldn't do.
My father is dead. Will you teach my brothers how to fight?
What is the world that you're living in that's the question that you ask?
The king is about provision. The warrior is about action. The magician is about understanding. And the lover is about meaning. And so if you have these four components, blessing, action, understanding, and meaning, package all these up into what makes a good father.
He didn't say, I love you. He said, I'm proud of you. And for him, that's the more powerful choice.
You are going to need to push them beyond what they believe that they're capable of, pulling out more than they think they have. That's growth. That's development.
How do I actually be a father? Because I've rejected this entire part of myself.
From an archetypal standpoint, he is maybe the greatest father in all of media.
Welcome everybody back to Frame of Mind, where psychology and filmmaking meet at the intersection of storytelling. My name is Jordan, I'm your filmmaker.
My name's Curtis, I'm your psychotherapist.
And Curtis, today we're taking a look at fathers.
Yeah.
And I have a clip that I've been sitting on for a little bit.
Okay.
I didn't know how to integrate it, but this is actually the perfect moment.
Cool, let's take a look.
So, Naruto, how would you confront this hatred in order to create peace? I want to know what your answer is.
I don't know.
Maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, but this was the point in time where there was this beautiful animation of the initial encounter between Naruto and Pain.
Yep.
And then they start to get into this big fight sequence right before planetary devastation. And it's like the animation quality just drops off a cliff. Completely empty backgrounds. Pain looks sort of like a garbled mess. It looks like a little bit of like Looney Tunes style animation.
It's seemingly maybe like less about artistic choices and more like actual quality.
Yeah, usually that happens in preparation for a big fight sequence.
Because they're always on a time crunch. You can only put so much work into so many things.
Yeah.
Some parts and scenes are going to be given a little bit less time than other ones are.
Yeah, you have to make sacrifices in some places. And usually that's why there's a lot of dialogue sequences where it's like nobody's moving, just the mouth's moving.
Yep.
And then like back and forth so that they have more time to put into the fight sequence.
Economical.
But in a weird way, it seems like they did the reverse here, where they put way less time into the fight sequence. And now they're putting a lot of time into stuff like this. Like this shot just blows me away. What's your initial feeling when you look at this shot?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, but like really comes to feeling for me is it's a little bit disturbing.
Yeah.
Like it's a little bit off kilter. There's something about the way that the water line is cutting across the screen unevenly. And especially something about the way that Naruto's face is upside down in the water so that his eyes are covered by the water. To me, like, I don't know if it's calling up the idea of me opening up my eyes underwater, but it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. I 100% agree. This really reminds me of, I'm not sure if you remember in The Dark Knight, there's that shot where Batman shoots his grappling cable towards the end at the Joker as he's falling off the cliff, and then he pulls him back up and the Joker's upside down. And the camera does this little tilt where it turns all the way around. So the Joker goes from upside down to right side up, and just the camera placement really makes you feel the way that it wants you to. Like the Joker's gone from upside down to like, no, actually I have all the power.
Yeah.
In the same way, this shot is literally screaming to me that he's in over his head.
Yeah.
Like everything about
underwater.
Everything about the shot is wrong. Like it's got a Dutch tilt. It's off axis. Things don't feel like, even like his body, he's underwater, but the wrong part of him is underwater.
Yeah.
What came right before this, his Pain was like, how would you fix this, Naruto? How would you deal with this pain? He's like, I don't know. Like I'm so lost.
There's something really cool about this idea. Because when Pain asks that question, to me, I get the sense of like, Naruto, what's your vision for the future? When he's asking about how do you deal with this pain? And then to have his eyes covered by the water, which will have this distorting effect.
Yeah.
And it's going to garble things and create a mess. Like really feels to me like it highlights the I don't know. I can't see a future past this hatred.
100%. Wow. I didn't even notice that until just now. It just gives me such an appreciation because I'm thinking about this right now from a filmmaker's perspective. Like this is such a simple shot in theory, but it's so difficult.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we need to have a room full of water. It needs to have somebody submerged in water. Okay, so we got to have safety people on standby. Oh, the camera's got to be underwater. Oh, okay. Oh, we got to be able to see his eyes perfectly underwater. We got to have underwater lights. We got to have like you're just thinking like, oh my goodness, this has gone from just like this simple concept to this minefield of how do you actually accomplish this in real life? But the beauty of animating is that you can just think about this and like, I just want to show this, and you can do that.
I think it's one of my favorite things about watching something that's animated versus something in real life is that there's so much, to me at least, it feels like there's so much more access to imaginative images. Like pictures that you, like you said, would be so difficult, time consuming, expensive to get in live action. But in animation, it's just like, if you think it, you can make it, which can give you a lot of these, what's the right word for me to use? Like almost surrealist images, which can be so helpful for communicating feeling.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Someone, please help me. Give me an answer.
Destroy everything. Give me your soul, your spirit, and in exchange, I will rescue you from your pain.
Yeah, it's interesting that he's rescuing him from his pain is the thing that he's promised.
Yeah.
Pain's the one that he's fighting. Pain's the thing that he had all throughout his childhood.
Yeah, it's this fascinating idea for me of like, does one really need to be rescued from their pain? Or is pain supposed to be a motivator for something else, for taking action, right? There's this fascinating idea too in what's happening here where it's like, what is the Ninetales offering Naruto? He's offering him an escape from his pain, but that is going to necessitate destruction.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of the time that's how people will normally react to, is that because of their pain, they'll go on and start to create destruction in their lives and in other people's lives. Ooh. And it feels like a perfect analogy for how most people are going to typically deal with their pain.
Yeah.
They're going to let the demon out. They're going to let everything take over. And they're just going to say, screw it, burn it all to the ground. So something about the way that he looked up immediately hit me as like, oh.
Because at this point of the series, like, you haven't been told that this is his father.
Yeah.
You've just been given context clues.
Yeah.
And you could have probably pieced it together. Most people did.
Yeah.
But it wasn't explicitly stated until this moment.
Yeah.
And I love this the way they're showing this, because like his dad is physically in between him and the Ninetales.
Yep.
They could have positioned that blocking in any way, but they chose to have him not side by side. They chose to have him literally standing in between him and the evil inside of himself. Yep. There's just a little thing here too. Do you notice that he's got sort of this really dark Rembrandt lighting where he's got that little bit underneath his eyes? Mm-hmm. This might just be me kind of going off on a crazy theory here, but he's got a little bit of light in his shadows, and he's got a little bit of shadow there on the light side of his face.
Yep.
And that's just the contours of the face.
Yep.
But they had to draw that. They had to make some very specific decisions about what that looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this is sort of bringing up a little bit of that yin-yang symbol. A little bit.
Absolutely.
Like there's just in the visual display of this, there's some light in the dark, there's some dark in the light. There's nuance to the idea that it's not just all good, it's not just all evil. Because even from the get-go, it's like there is literal evil inside of you.
Yeah.
So that's baked in from the beginning, and it's being shown in the shot.
Well, and then there's spoilers potentially for, like, at the end of the series, this way that the Ninetales and Naruto are engaging with each other ends up getting reversed, where right now the demon is asking Naruto to submit to him, but then at the end, when he really needs it, the demon ends up submitting to Naruto. And so there is that, like, yes, he's dark and it's evil, but there's a potential to utilize it for a valuable, good, pure purpose.
There might be some Jungian shadow type context in there.
There might be potentially.
Just a little bit. If you strip down everything else, kind of what you're left with is that his dad didn't actually have to be there. It's guised in this sort of in your mind chakra sense, but
Yeah.
his dad wasn't even there.
Yeah.
It's just the concept of his dad, the idea of your father, that in and of itself is enough to stop you from evil.
So that makes me wonder then, like, what is it about your father that does that? Like, when we're talking about it's Minato here, it's his father, what does he represent? What does he mean?
We'd have a lot of stuff in the world figured out at this point if we could really concisely convey that answer. I think I have some ideas. For whatever reason, a father is so important to the degree that the absence of him will create a vacuum that will be filled by something.
Yeah.
Like, it's such an important integral piece of who you are as a person, whether that's how you grew up, the way that you were raised, the way that they taught you, whatever it is. It's like in the early stages of this show, you saw that he was getting into trouble. He was latching on to people who weren't necessarily the best. And then eventually it took somebody imposing themselves into that position.
Yeah.
Kind of stepping into that position for themselves in order to actually give him something that would actually be at least something akin to a dad.
If people had found out you were my son, you would have been in danger.
Dad. Why would you ever want to steal the nine tails inside of your own son? Do you have any idea what I went through because you did that? All of the grown-ups just looked at me with contempt or with fear, and I couldn't make any friends. I just wanted people to accept me, or at least not hate me. I got stronger, but couldn't stop the Akatsuki from killing my friends. And I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Damn it, am I supposed to be happy or mad? I don't even know.
What was his reaction?
He punched him in the stomach.
Yeah, but where did he punch him?
Yeah, in the gut.
In the gut.
In the same place where the seal is.
In the same place where the seal was. All of the pain that Naruto's felt.
As a result of that thing being inside of him.
As a result of the thing being inside him that his dad put there.
Yeah.
He's now in a weird way saying, this is what you did to me. This is the pain that you gave me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the pain that you gave me was a result of what you couldn't do.
Yeah. Where you fell short, where you weren't enough, where you were not able to stop the pain and the destruction. That's now created pain for me.
In a weird way, I've inherited your shortcomings. The worst parts about you. And like Minato's like set
amazing in so many different ways.
Like theoretically like perfect.
Yeah.
But in this one sense, it's like you weren't able to deal with this.
Yeah.
And so now it's become my burden.
Yeah. Well, it's the sins of the father are passed to the children.
I've heard that saying before, but when you say that as a therapist, like what are you talking about?
Well, there's a concept that we have about intergenerational trauma. It gets tossed around a lot these days, and it's an important thing for us to be looking through. But I don't know how much people really understand the mechanics of intergenerational trauma, because the idea is the things that happen to your parents will have an impact and an influence on you, right? And so people will talk about this in lots of different ways with lots of, through wars, genocides, lots of traumatic things that people will go through, there's this fallout effect that further generations see. But the question is, why do they experience that? Because they're not there for the initial experience.
Yes.
Right? So you and I come from immigrant war refugee families.
Yes.
We were not there during World War II.
Yeah.
We never experienced having to pack everything up and run for our lives. So why do we still experience some of the impacts in our family that are a result of that?
And to be clear to maybe people who are listening, we're not talking about PTSD. We're talking about our grandfather was a hoarder, and now I, for the life of me, will not throw away any little knickknack or trinket ever, period. Everything is valuable. Everything is needed.
Yeah. Well, and there's other pieces that go along with that too, but I think the crux of where it ends up having an impact on people further down the line is that the things that you experience will end up having a shaping effect on your, I don't know if I want to say personality or your actions going forward. Because I almost want to make a distinction between personality and post-traumatic reactions.
Yes.
A lot of the time people will confuse those things for being the same thing, but the reactions that you have because of traumatic experiences that you go through you think about those actions are also going to have consequences too. You develop traits, right? Something like, for example, I lost everything, so now I'm going to hold everything together. I'm not going to let anything go. Who's going to be most exposed to those actions? Your family, specifically your kids.
Yes.
And now your kids have to grow up almost with, because of your actions, as a result of what happened to you, almost like the echoes of that original trauma. It's like your actions in many ways carry forward the effects of that trauma, and then it has an impact on the next generation, and then that generation has that echo further down the line. And so there is really this idea when it comes to you failed and now I have to suffer. I love the symbolism here because it really is accurate for real life. Wherever your parents, less so in like a saving the world type of way, but more of where your parents have failed to develop, where they have failed to actualize themselves, where they have failed to properly address trauma and difficulties in their own life, because of the way that they will then interact with you, you're going to reap some of the negative results of that.
Now, you're talking about that specifically from the nurture side of things.
Yeah, it is a little bit different than, or at least it seems like at least that way that we're nurtured, the actions that you take when you're in relationship with me, in my opinion anyways, they seem like the main mechanic of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
There's potentially some pieces around genetics and epigenetics and how your genes change as a result of trauma, for sure.
Maybe I can speak to that because that's like before I dropped out of applying to med school, this was the last thing that I studied. There's a particular study that everybody references when they talk about this. Basically what happened is they took a generation of mice and they created a system where they would expose them to a particular smell and they would be shocked at the same time. And so they would induce this fear response to the degree where they eventually got them to be afraid of the smell, so that when they smelt it, they would respond the same way as if they were being shocked. Yeah. And then what they did is they bred these mice, and then they looked at the children, and they didn't shock the second generation of mice, but they exposed them to the cherry blossom smell, and they were still experiencing that same fear response. And it lasted for 2 to 3 generations.
Yeah.
It's really tough to prove this in humans because you can't exactly do that to people. But there are experiences in the world that mimic this. Like, for example, the genetic descendants of Holocaust survivors had a higher likelihood of experiencing PTSD just because they were their children.
Yeah.
That has more or less been established as a fact. We don't necessarily know the mechanism. There is some epigenetic, like epi just means on top of genetics, your actual ATGC, base pair sequences, those don't change.
Yeah.
But the information on top of those that's sort of activating or deactivating them, those do change.
The idea which genes get turned on, which genes get turned off.
Yeah. And so I wonder how much the changing genetic component not only passes on experiences like that or creates longer echoes of that experience into second, third generations, but also how much does that reinforce that nurture element that you were talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
How much more potent is the way that you interact with your child when that child has almost experienced a little bit of that same thing as well in a genetic sense?
You think it's like the combination of nature and nurture working together.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, theoretically, if we pull out the trauma element of this, it's a fascinating way that human beings, and probably other animals too, but like the way that we as genetic organisms with genetic material, the way that these systems work together to help us adapt.
Yes.
Right? It's like it's priming us. You can almost think like that epigenetic process is almost priming us to be ready so that as soon as the same thing happens, it's like we're already 3 steps ahead. We're ready to go. Yeah. It's so potentially helpfully adaptive depending on the circumstance that we're in, but it can also be something that perpetuates this trauma response.
Well, I mean, that's almost maybe the nefarious thing about it is that it's the correct response, but you're no longer in the situation where that's helpful. If you were still a prisoner in World War II Germany, that response might be helpful, but you're not anymore.
If you're still on the savannah in Africa and your parents have an interaction with a lion and you're still there, you grow up there and it primes you for how to interact with lions, wonderfully adaptive. But the fact that things can change like this in our modern world, and you can move from Eastern Europe to Canada, and within the span of 2 or 3 generations, like within the span of 5 years, the war is over, right? but the echoes of that are still going to have an impact on people trying to live their normal day-to-day lives in a brand new country. Speaking of war.
Everybody, I'm coming for everybody! Kill everybody!
I've been in this game my whole life. I've never seen anything like him.
Khamzat Chimaev, ladies and gentlemen!
So Patrick Gavia, what he does, which is really cool, is it's not like journalism, like going and asking questions. He might do some of that stuff, but it's not the predominant thing that I love him for. It's actually his fascinating and really artistically put together long form pieces on individual UFC fighters. And when you and I were talking about doing stuff with fathers, there was something fascinating that showed up in this breakdown of Khamzat specifically.
Okay.
I mean, you talk about the epigenetic stuff that you and I were talking about before, of like born into a place where people were saying welcome to hell.
Yeah.
Right?
And how much does that breed a great UFC fighter? But I'm guessing maybe what comes out in other places.
But although he struggles with controlling his emotions, someone else makes sure he stays on the right path.
If that one was my big brother, maybe I was in some jail somewhere.
Why do you say that?
Because I'm sometimes a crazy guy. And I need somebody to stop me.
And he does that by making Khamzat wrestle.
I was only wrestler because my brother put me everywhere. If other village they have boxing, they have like sambo. My brother wanna put me everywhere.
Khamzat finds success wrestling, while Chechnya suffers another blow.
This is tons of fighter stories. Like, I would be in jail, I would be dead if it wasn't for fighting, because it's some sort of outlet, right? And it very much seems to me like a similar idea of what was happening in the Naruto piece, where it's like, here's this destructive tendency that could come out.
Yeah.
But there's an opportunity to channel it somewhere, usually manifested by somebody else, father figure, older brother, whoever, who's like, direct it somewhere.
And in the midst of it all, one question from an orphan girl. She reportedly asked, "My father is dead. Can you please teach my brothers how to fight?"
Wow. I would have never have guessed that that's the question she asked, but now hearing that makes the most sense. It fits so well.
Every single time I watch that, I feel like Minato getting punched in the gut. Like, every single time. And I've been trying to pull out exactly what it is. I think there's first of all, the way that Patrick kind of pulls this stuff together is really cool. And he obviously puts some feeling behind it with his scene choices, how he builds it up, the music, all that stuff.
The editing is really well done. The way he structured the story so that like the very first thing is giving you context. That question she asks is lingering in your mind the entire way through. That's like the string that's pulling you through from the start to the end.
Yeah. To me, this is going to sound like a weird way to describe it, but there's something elegant about the question that she asks him. Because the way that elegant was described to me was the idea of maximum depth with minimum complexity. It's like, I'm saying the most things that I can in the fewest words possible.
That's a really good way to put it.
And there's something about the idea of this orphan girl saying, "My father is dead. Will you teach my brothers how to fight?" That feels like it contains so much information about not just her experience, but so many other things about like the idea of fathers. Yeah. That was the thing that stood out to me. First and foremost, I want to say the character of this girl. And I don't mean that in terms of like her as a character. I mean her character of integrity is so impressive to me, that she's in this position and her focus and her question is, my family is struggling with something. I am looking out for my brothers. Yeah. I want somebody to support them, take care of them, have the best for them. So just her strength of character is something that blows me away. But what I was really sitting with was this idea of what her question says about the absence of fathers. So this was where it was kind of an inversion. I was thinking with the Naruto piece, like, here's an example of what happens when you have a father who's stepping into a difficult piece. But what happens when there isn't one? And what is the gap and the void that leaves? And it was fascinating to me that because that's the context of her question. My father is dead. Here is this gap. But then the actual driving question for her is, will you teach my brothers how to fight? like, to me, there's so many things that feel like comes into that. One being like, somebody needs to teach my brothers to be capable.
Yeah.
Because here we are in a space that is in upheaval. There's violence. My brothers need to be capable to protect themselves and their families and us. Right. And somebody needs to teach them how to do that. But there's also something about the idea of, in the absence of a father, what will happen to their development if they don't have somebody to help them focus it?
Yeah.
And so can you, as somebody, you know, in Khamzat who's been through the same thing, can you help my brothers to focus their energy in the same way that you did in the absence of having a father?
Yeah. And the way that he structured this piece here, you can see how there's an interpretation that's easily digestible, where Khamzat said, I would have kind of ended up in some pretty dark places if it wasn't for my brother. The assumption is that that's what'll happen to these boys if Khamzat doesn't teach them how to fight. You say that question is elegant. I think that's so true. The question implies that they need to fight.
Yeah.
Like they need to know how
they're
to do
going
this.
to have to at some point.
Can you do this for them? Because they need this. But on top of that too, there's a piece where it's not spoken outright, but it's this idea of, will you step into this role as a father figure to them?
Because that would have been my father's job.
Yeah. And it's you said elegant. It's so much more elegant, instead of to say, will you be their father? Will you take the role of the father? Will you teach them to fight?
Yeah.
This thing that the father should have done.
There's like the implication.
Yeah.
Right.
It's also the implication that there's also nobody else in their life that could take that place.
Yeah.
Like, there is no one else who can fill this role currently.
Yeah.
It's empty, and it's going to be filled. That void that we talked about, that vacuum is going to be filled by something.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a terrifying thing to think about, that what is the world that you're living in, that's the question that you ask? Like, it's one thing to say that's wonderful of her character, and I agree, but at the same time, how dark is it in the world?
For a girl who's maybe 11 years old. Yeah. Like, she's already had to grow up so much.
Yeah.
To be knowing that I need to make sure that the people around me are taken care of.
Yeah.
Like, that's her focus. There's almost like a parentification happening because of the trauma that's been experienced.
Yeah. And how much does it imply? How much has she seen, or what has she experienced?
Yeah.
That this would be the thing that she asks.
Yep.
It's haunting is what I would call it.
There's a couple different things that I've thought about when we've been preparing for this, that when we see fathers presented and represented by people in stories, what are they trying to communicate and show? What is the role that they're playing in the narrative to organize everything that's happening?
Yeah.
And there's, I think, kind of two big ideas that I've thought about. One is this, kind of going back to the yin and yang that you were talking about. It's like there's almost two parts that I see fathers having in this kind of more like masculine energy role. And I don't necessarily mean males. I mean, because, you know, in Jungian archetypes, there's anima, animus, male and the female, female and the male. So everybody has a component of this. But in this kind of masculine archetype, a big piece of what it seems like the masculine energy provides, especially for children, is this idea of structure. And the structure I'm thinking about specifically is almost has this like yin yang element to it, where on the one hand, and maybe this is where we can start talking about some other fathers that can represent this, there's this almost like this putting forward of a value or a goal. It's like a father's element is here to say, this is what life is about. This is where things are. This is what you should do. This is how you should act moving forward. Right? The primary archetype that I think about when I think about the father taking this role is actually Uncle Ben in Spider-Man.
Yeah.
So it's very explicitly stated, Peter, remember, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is coming from somebody who's not a superhero, but it doesn't matter because he's still in that fatherly role.
Yeah, and it's weird that he's actually not a father. He's Uncle Ben.
There's so many of those where it's like these step-in father figures, right?
Yeah.
Like even in Naruto.
Yeah.
You're thinking about like Jiraiya, Kakashi, Iruka. Here, Khamzat being asked to step in a role. Like, I feel like so often in media, what we see is people being asked to step into a really critical role for somebody else. So,
and maybe that's also a good point to clarify that that you can have somebody who's not your father filling that role of the father.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they're not a good person, but there's something special about being a dad.
Yeah.
Like you could even have a mother fulfilling that fatherly role, but it's going to be harder. It's not that you can't fulfill that role. If you're a single dad, you have to fill that motherly role too, but it's going to be harder. So what I find interesting in that Uncle Ben example is like, you see that there's a little bit of this disconnect because there's that fatherly role that's being fulfilled, but there's like that slight little distance because you're not actually the dad.
So in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, I feel like that disconnect is kind of put forward from Peter Parker's end.
Yes.
Right? It's not from Uncle Ben's side. It's that Peter saying, yeah, sure, Uncle Ben, whatever, and kind of dismiss it. Honestly, though, like...
But how much of that is real life?
Yeah, and how much of that would even be if he was his biological father?
Yeah.
Like you think about the relationship with anybody, which comes, I think, to the other side. Because there is one piece where the father is here to provide this structure in terms of values. Here's your goal. Here's your aim. Here's how you should live life. Let me provide for you like almost a template by which to enter into your dialogue with life with. Here are the things you should do. Here are the things that you shouldn't do, to lay it out for them. But on the flip side, there's also an element where children kind of have to overcome their fathers.
Yes.
They kind of have to surpass them. They kind of have to break out of the mold. And so there's two parts where it's like there's an important structural element, but there's also a piece where kids have to move beyond.
Well, that moving beyond piece is really tied into a really common story element where you see that the role of the father in a negative sense sometimes can be you need to fulfill this legacy. Like you need to run the family business.
Yeah.
You need to keep going what I've built for you.
Yeah.
Like that's a common thing. Like the family business, you need to run it. And then the kid goes like, no, I want to be an artist.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with the kid.
I don't want to be a plumber. I don't want to be a farmer. Like I want to go and do my own thing. So that's a very common trope in filmmaking to like, you need to break out of the mold.
Yeah.
And that's the negative element of like that fatherly, like that obligation, that piece of like taking on the legacy or the burden or the responsibility or even the failings of your father and having to continue that on.
In my mind, this is the best thing that I've come across so far. There's an idea we're talking about when it comes to specifically masculine archetypes where this book I've found particularly interesting.
So the king, warrior, magician, lover.
Yeah. So it's written by two psychologists.
There's a lot of tabs in here. First of all, just breaking the fourth wall here a little bit. Look at how many tabs there are.
I may have dug into it a little bit and
Have
been
you
doing some
studied
research.
this?
I might have been doing a little bit of digging into it.
There's more notes than printed writing on here.
Well, it's a fascinating idea because I love archetypal psychology.
Yeah.
I love this idea of what are the intangible structures in our minds that are driving our actions and how do they create problems, but also how can we harness them and use them? So when it comes to these four archetypes, the thing that's interesting to me about fathers is it feels like a complex archetype or a meta archetype, if that makes sense. There are very, very specific archetypes. Like there is the jester, there is the magician, there is like all this kind of stuff. But father feels more like a role that is comprised of multiple archetypes.
Yeah, there's not just one.
Exactly. Fathers do lots of stuff. When you use some of these archetypes, specifically these four, the king, the warrior, the magician, lover, and if you can pull those together into the one archetype of the father, say, how do these four play out and show up in the fathers that we observe? Or how do they not show up? Because there are also some... they call them shadow poles.
Yeah.
So for all of the potential benefits of each of these archetypes, they also have their own shadows.
Yeah.
They have their challenges and their problems.
I think screaming in my mind is the former past self of me saying, why should I care about an archetype? Like, why should I contain myself and put myself or my situation into a rigid box rather than escaping it and becoming the best version that I can possibly be?
Yeah. And I think, honestly, that's a misinterpretation of the idea of archetypes. Archetypes aren't boxes. for you to have to fit in specifically. They're more like symbols that you can use to represent your experience.
It's a shortcut to be able to get quickly to an idea without having to put a lot of work into it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a handle that you can grab onto, because we use the exact same thing in emotions, right? One of the rules that we have for when you express your emotions healthily is they need to be symbolized in some way. Maybe that's a picture that kind of represents it. Maybe it's a feeling state in my body that I have. Maybe it's a way that I use my words to express and represent how I'm feeling. But in order for things to be able to be engaged with, it's like, especially with emotions, I like the idea that because they're intangible, they need some sort of tangible handle for me to grab onto in order for me to use them to my advantage.
Yeah.
And I think archetypes are exactly the same. There are rules that you are playing by in your life. There are roles that are set out for you, whether you like it or not, by society, right? Because we live in cultures, because we seem to be humans, especially with Carl Jung's work, what his idea is that archetypes live in the collective unconscious. It's like you can't escape from these things simply because you're human. But we can use them to make what is intangible in us tangible, to then be able to move and shift it and make things different for ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like there's a gear that I need to turn in order to change my life in the way that I want it to. And an archetype is like the handle that I stick into the gear so that I can actually start to crank it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, now I have some control over the direction of my life.
Even if you wanted to reject it, let's say, you have to know what it is first in order to reject it.
Exactly. To reject it, to overcome it, or to transform it into a version of this that fits for you. I like to think about it more like you are never any of the archetypes. The archetypes are active inside of you. And so it's, when is this part showing up?
Yeah.
When is this part showing up? If I was going to break down these 4 archetypes, the king tends to be about, let's say, creating order in the world. The words associated with the king are order, fertility, and blessing. And the idea is, in a actualized king, in the good version of the king, it is bringing prosperity to the world. And that, in a more tangible context for our relationships, it means bringing prosperity to other people, not you.
Right.
You're here, and it's almost like there's some ideas with divine masculinity where, you know, there's this ideal, there's this goal, there's this good. And the king is the person who takes that good and comes down and delivers it to the people around him. So you can think about this as in terms of a father. The king archetype is playing out as a caregiver, right? He's like, he's giving good things to his children. And the part I like to think about, especially when it comes to like fertility and blessing, is he's giving good things to his kids, but it's not like this, I'm giving you gifts. Is the king doing something that pulls life out of his kids? And a lot of the time what that means is, does he see them and recognize them for the goodness that is inherent within them? Their positive traits, their interests, their values. Like, how has life uniquely showed up in this child? And it's the father's role through the king archetype to pull that life out of his kids in the way that is the biggest blessing for them, not for him.
Yeah. With regards to the king archetype, specifically, you talked about fertility. Like, immediately what came to my mind is Mufasa in The Lion King. Think about the beautiful world that just visually existed when Mufasa was king. And then when Scar takes over, the land itself is no longer fertile and it's just dead. I think that's a good image to have when you're thinking about that.
Well, Lion King is it's right in the title. It's a phenomenal archetypal story about this, right? So that's the king element. So when we're looking at the warrior archetype, the warrior, it's energetic, decisive, courageous, enduring, loyal to the greater good. There's lots of pieces around the warrior that are really about action. And the warrior is related to power, but specifically in his idealized form, power over self, not others. So there's like this pattern, this theme that's showing up, right? Like, king is about providing benefits to others. Warrior is about power over oneself, self-control, right? The focusing of that action, right? Which again, you'll see a lot in what we were talking about before with fighters, with Khamzat, all that stuff. It's the warrior energy takes that energy and it focuses it into a very specific beneficial goal.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say over yourself and not others.
Yeah.
Because how much of that warrior archetype is displayed in a really positive way as the warrior who chooses not to fight.
Yep.
The Obi-Wan Kenobi who decides, Vader can strike me down because there's actually a greater purpose.
Exactly. And then the magician and the warrior are kind of on opposite planes.
Mm-hmm.
So they work in tandem with one another, where the warrior is more about action and energy.
Mm-hmm.
The magician's more about observation.
Observation. Okay.
So it's knowledge, understanding, the ability to grasp a situation without acting.
Right.
With watching it rather than doing something on it, right? Instead of imposing yourself on it by taking a step forward, the magician takes a step back. You think about like the warriors on the battlefield, he's taking action, he's charging forward. The magician typically is in his tower and he's back and he's researching and he's looking and understanding. So it's kind of these two opposing poles that work together.
Gotcha.
And then opposing the king is the lover. And the lover is where the king is more about taking that divine ideal and bringing it down to the people around him. The lover is actually more about being on that mortal plane, but then looking up towards what is good, what is beneficial, where should I be going? And the lover tends to provide meaning. So you think about these four archetypes and they tend to be: the king is about provision, the warrior is about action, the magician is about understanding, and the lover is about meaning. And so if you have these four components, right? You have your blessing, action, understanding, and meaning. If we package all these up into what makes a good father, I think a lot of the time we'll see the archetypes play out. But then they also have their shadow sides.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I guess there's an absence of each of those traits has a really negative connotation as well.
Exactly. And it gets complex because then there's two poles to each of those. But essentially, to make it easier, right, the shadow side of these archetypes is essentially using it for the wrong purposes, right? It's a big simplification, but I think it makes sense. Like the king who tries to provide benefit for himself rather than others. The warrior who tries to impose power over other people rather than control over himself. The magician who is looking to, rather than understand the world, know how to manipulate people to his own purposes. And then the lover being someone who, instead of looking towards what the good or ideal is, tries to consume it all and take it all for himself. Those are kind of the basics around the archetypes. And the thing that I'd be curious about, because I mean, you mentioned already a few, I think it'd be interesting to look at where do we see these showing up in different types of fathers that we see in stories.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, like right off the bat, like we can go back to the Lion King. Even though the king aspect is the most prominent, obviously, in the Lion King, Mufasa is kind of a really good representation of all of those. And at the very least, maybe he is not the person who is all four, but at the very least, he embodies all four by the people he keeps around him. Yeah. You think about how
absolutely.
Rafiki is the magician,
100%.
and maybe that's not Mufasa, but he's got such a good relationship with him that environment has a magician.
Yeah.
You have king, warrior, magician, lover, all in the context of Pride Rock when it's at its best. And the death of Mufasa is the thing that loses all of that.
Yep.
And so in a weird way, I think The Lion King is a great example because it's an illustration of when all of those four things are present, it's really great. And when all of those things are absent because of the death of Mufasa, it's terrible.
Yep. And then you see who shows up, but Scar to kind of take over, who is the perfect representation of the tyrannical father, right? You think about the way that he treats the lionesses, right? That's an addicted lover. That's him being like, oh, they're all for me. They're here to serve me, rather than me being here to benefit them and provide them with meaning. He's, sitting there eating all the food while everybody else is starving. I mean, like they, without being too explicit about it, they did a great job in that show of showing rather than telling. They didn't say, oh, here's all these things. They told about the context of what Scar was doing.
Yeah.
But they're really representing symbolically through the visuals that they're presenting in the show. Here's how he is the inverse of Mufasa in all four of these traits. You already mentioned another pairing that I think works really well with this, which is Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Oh, 100%.
In that original Star Wars trilogy, this is like, I don't know if I would call Obi-Wan the father as much as I would the mentor, but he's kind of filling that role, especially as Vader's old teacher.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's an interesting look into that because Luke's father is present, but really the person who is playing that father role is Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was playing that father role to Anakin in a sense.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting overlap where the father's present, but that role is being taken up by somebody else.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because in a lot of ways you can see in the original trilogy, like Obi-Wan is trying to prevent the sins of the father from visiting the son because of his sins that were visited on the son, right?
Yeah.
Like there's this because he's playing the role of father for Vader, but then Vader is the father for Anakin. And then that traumatic experience occurs. And then it's like, well, now I've got to figure it out and I got to fix it. And
it's almost like Obi-Wan is trying to say to himself, I hope I don't mess up again.
Yeah.
Let me take this kid and hopefully stop what happened last time.
Yeah. There's an interesting irony too with how what Obi-Wan does is he strikes down Anakin.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the beginning of the new series, he actually does say, well, I'm not going to mess up again, which actually requires sacrificing himself.
Yeah. Sacrificing him in exactly the same way that he did to Anakin previously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's something cool about that I love.
Yeah. For all the woes of the original trilogy, it's got some really amazing symbolism in it.
Absolutely. 100%. I'm curious from your perspective, because I got a huge list here, but who else to you really stands out as like fathers in media?
You know, a really weird one that for me really works, but you don't think about it until you really have it hit you in the face, is Carl from Up. The whole premise, the whole intro 10-minute montage that makes everybody cry was because a big piece of it was because him and Ellie couldn't have children. Being a father was central to the film from like the very beginning. The very first emotional ton of bricks that's hit you with is like, I can't be a father.
Yeah.
And now when you're given this opportunity, it's that battling of like, how do I actually be a father? Because I've rejected this entire part of myself.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then him learning to open up that part of himself again. And how do I actually, even though I'm not like his dad, how do I fulfill this role? Because it's not just needed in him, it's needed in me too. It takes all of the emotion of the idea of these archetypal ideas of the father, but it does it in a way that you don't even think they're talking about fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like you're secretly being stabbed with these emotions. Like, why am I feeling this way?
Yeah.
And you don't really see it until you circle around and realize like, oh no, like the idea of him being this father to Russell is just, that's the film, but you don't see it until you take a mile step back and look at it from so far away.
Yeah. When you're actually watching the film as an audience member, it's not the primary thing that's in your face. It's kind of the background element that ties everything together, but it's that invisible sewing that you don't see. It's that thread that pulls everything together.
Yeah, that thread that's holding the balloons up, that's pulling them into a new world. It's taking them to South America. Yeah, so that's one that came to my mind.
Daddy-o! What's up? Will, I'm glad you're here. Some business came up I gotta handle. So we're gonna have to put our trip on hold. You understand?
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
Just for a couple of weeks.
I understand.
Maybe a little longer.
Yeah, whatever.
Look, I'll call you next week and we'll iron out the details, okay?
Yeah.
It was great seeing you, son.
You too, Lou.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating one because to me, it says, I know I messed up, but I don't know how to do it differently.
Yeah.
Like, I know that I did the wrong thing, but this is just the same thing that always happens, and I can't escape this cycle.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Will.
In this scene in particular, what Uncle Phil is doing in this role of kind of surrogate father is actually lots of nothing, which is really valuable. Like, he's letting Will's character just express everything that's going on. And especially, it's beautifully put with the hug at the end and then the pan to the statue of like, Phil really is being the container for Will in that moment. It's like, hey, you can have your big feelings, kid. It's okay. He explicitly says it. It's okay to be angry because I'm here as the adult, as the father figure. You can have your chaotic, overwhelming emotions, and I've got you. I'm here to support you. And there's this beautiful piece here where, like, this is something that mothers, fathers, whoever, doesn't matter, parents in general, when your child is in distress, one of the biggest things that you need to be doing is called co-regulation. It's the idea of when somebody's in distress, if you can be there as a calming and soothing presence, that is probably more important than anything else you could say or do. And he's letting him have the space, and he's here as the support when all the feelings come through and brings Will to his core pain, and he finally starts to fall apart. It's this beautifully done, like, I'll give you the space you need, and then I'll provide the containment when you need it. And it's like, again, shown, not told, all implied. In many ways, in my mind, it's like close to a flawless scene. It's beautifully done.
So true. And it's so cool too how this was the gift that Will was going to give to his father. It's just such a it's a little bit on the nose, but it's like it's just under the surface enough to really come through that, like, you were supposed to do this for me.
Yeah.
And you didn't.
Yeah. And there's almost this, like, by giving it to him, it's almost kind of like an olive branch of like, yeah, we've got this trip planned. Can you be this for me now?
Yeah. And then he's not able to.
Yeah.
But then Will doesn't even realize that this is actually this was already always being done to him.
Yep.
Like, you didn't need to search for this. This is currently being given to you.
Yep. The figure in the statue holding this child from behind and kind of this containment. I've got you. I'm here to support you. I've got your back. Contrasting that with where Minato shows up for Naruto in between him and his demon.
Yeah.
And it's like containment can look very different. Support, fatherhood looks very different depending on what the situation is.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need this hand to hold. Sometimes you need to be in between your child and the danger.
It's so sad, but it is kind of cool how he doesn't even see how much his uncle's been doing for him.
Yeah.
Both of these examples are where the father was not present. And on top of that, for most of their life, up until one brief moment, there wasn't even access to the father.
Yeah.
Like, it's cool because in the Naruto example, like, you were able to have a full-on conversation with your father, but that wasn't that wasn't your dad. That was the idea of him. That was the leftovers in your mind, kind of this representation of him. Is there an equivalent in psychology or in therapy where you can almost have this conversation with somebody when you don't have access to them?
Yeah. I did it last week. No, it's funny because it's actually a tool that I love to use with clients because it has such a powerful impact. And the term for it, there's a couple names for it. The technical term is it's called empty chair work. The other name it goes by is unfinished business. So it's the idea of, if you and I were sitting here in a therapy session, you were my client and you were telling me about, like, you were in Will's position, right? My dad was never here for me, never did this, and I have all this anger that's kind of pent up towards him. What I would actually do is I would pull in a third chair and I would say, okay, so you and I are going to put your dad in this chair. I want you to imagine him like he is actually here. And then I give you some prompts around, like, imagine what he would look like, what would he be wearing, what would his posture be, where do you want to position him in this scenario that we're doing? And then I would get you to connect with your emotion and express that to your father in the chair that you're imagining. And it sounds crazy to people, but it's cool how when you set that scenario up, there really is this almost like access to the flow of emotion and experience where it feels like there's a tangible releasing of all that stuff. You're able to say it in a way where it feels like you're connecting to this person. Even though they're not there, even if in real life they would never sit down to have that conversation with you, there are ways that if you do it for yourself, you can still gain the benefits of having had that conversation. Again, it goes back to what we were talking about before about symbolizing your emotions through expression, through your words, is hugely important in actually transforming them, making them different, getting relief from the intensity and being able to move forward with something different.
Right.
So yeah, if Will came in to see me as therapy, that is absolutely. And the cool thing too is that if Will had come in to see me in therapy, that empty chair, unfinished business exercise is exactly what I would do with him. But then as almost like a containing or resolving piece, what I could do is I could say, okay, you've expressed all this stuff to your dad and he can't be there for you. So who else can we use who would listen to what you're saying and who would support you? Who would have your back? And this is where we could pull in a figure like, well, I have my uncle and I'm living with him and he provides things for me and he's supporting me and he's there for me in my difficult times. And we could have Uncle Phil come into the scene and be like, okay, when you need things from your dad, but you can't get them here, what is it like when you ask Uncle Phil? And to get that connection going. So it's like, oh, I'm having that need met. I'm okay. To connect Will to that feeling of being supported and held if he hasn't become aware of it yet could be, I mean, just think about like that would be a phenomenal session to do. But the cool thing too is that what we're doing in therapy is kind of it's like a recreation or reconstruction.
Almost like creating a scene like in a movie.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so it's in some ways kind of like we had talked about in previous episodes. There's something about constructing these stories that helps you experience something that you wouldn't otherwise.
Right.
So by constructing the story, you can actually experience what it'd be like to express all this to your dad when you can't.
Right.
But the thing that I love is that what we're doing in therapy really in some ways is recreating what this scene would have done for Will if it had been a real experience. Like if he was a real person and this was a real scenario that was happening, having Uncle Phil be there for him as that space to express what he is feeling to a figure like this, in many ways actually could be a healing process for Will to go through. So this moment, this scene could almost do as much as him going to therapy could. It's just one of the reasons that therapy is really valuable is that we can't guarantee or count on these things happening.
Yeah.
We can't guarantee or count on that another attachment figure is going to come into your life to support you. And so therapy is a great tool when there's an absence. But the thing that I love to see the most is when people can do this organically in their lives with the people who are around them. To me, that's like, if every single person in the world could do this, I would give up my job in a heartbeat because it means I'm not needed anymore.
The best therapy is done in real life with people around you.
Exactly. The best therapy is done within relationships, right? And so sometimes people need help, coaching, support, but it's one of the reasons that I love this scene is like, this is what's supposed to happen. This is me being like, I'm not needed. I can take a lunch break because Uncle Phil's got it.
There's a few jobs like that, doctor, firefighter, therapist, where it's just like, wouldn't the world be so great if I wasn't needed?
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. I love that idea. I think about it all the time. Like, and in many ways, kind of what I hope to do, I don't know if this podcast will help do it, but there's lots of things that I want to do with my career where it's like, how close can I get to working myself and every other therapist out of a job? How close can we get to being in a world where I'm not needed in this position? I'll go do something else. But to know that everybody in the world has these relationships where they can take their pain and process it and come out and transform it into some beautiful new direction for their life and healing, it's like, boy, I'd give almost anything to see a world like that. There are so many fathers that I think that could represent positive and negative traits.
100%.
Like, so we talked about Uncle Ben, we talked about Darth Vader, like people like Geppetto.
Yeah.
Right? Phil Dunphy from Modern Family. Homer Simpson, right? Even somebody like Walter White.
Yeah.
Right? Uncle Iroh from Avatar.
Yeah.
Like one of my favorite characters.
You know what I find interesting though is that you said Homer Simpson. He almost feels like he doesn't have any of those qualities, but he's still a wonderful person. He's not a king. He's definitely not a wizard.
Yeah.
He's definitely not a warrior.
Yeah.
And he's definitely not a lover. He kind of is a little bit, but like he's not any of those.
See, I think Homer's maybe a good example then of like somebody where those types of archetypes are still going to be active, but they're not going to look as obvious as they would in somebody else, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're showing up in really small ways.
Yeah.
So like maybe a good example actually with Homer Simpson would be one of the episodes where Maggie is born. The whole climax of the episode is Homer gives up his dream job in order to support his family. And it's like, is he a king for 99% of the show? Absolutely not. He's a bumbling moron. But in that particular moment, the story writers are driving home this king archetype in this one action that he does.
And how much of the fact that he is bumbling for 99% of it, how much does that highlight how kingly this one action
Well,
actually
contrast, right? It sets it up because it's so different from the rest of his character.
Yeah.
There is one set of characters who are fathers who I really wanted to talk about.
Okay.
Because I feel like they get a very bad rap.
Oh, let's hear it. Okay.
But my mind has started to change even while we've been talking about whether or not they're good dads or not.
Okay, I'm excited. Let's hear it.
So they are Goku and Vegeta.
So
arguably, I think a lot of people would say two of the worst dads in film is lots of people's opinion.
To be honest, I don't know the Dragon Ball franchise that intimately.
Yeah.
I have a cursory enough knowledge where I can definitely see that. But for context, feel free to fill in the gaps. Just treat me like I don't know.
I mean, the most basic thing, if you know even the bare minimum about who these two characters are in the franchise that they're part of, for both of them when their kids are born, like become quite absentee fathers. Goku, it's a little bit less his fault because he dies, but there's still this idea of he makes a choice to stay dead just so that he can train. He's like, I want to be the big, and here's maybe like the excess of the warrior versus like
to say.
It's a little bit much where he's like, no, I'm going to stay dead so that I can train with all these super powerful fighters. My son will be fine by himself, right? And it's kind of around Goku's character of being very like happy-go-lucky, kind of not really thinking things through. Vegeta's is a little bit more nefarious because, I mean, if you want an example of a narcissist, Vegeta's probably one of your best examples of this, who's only thinking about himself, has the most inflated idea of himself. Like literally calling himself, I'm the prince of my entire race, and carries that on as the core of his character for the majority of the show. But there's one moment for each of these characters that I think really stands out in many ways, kind of like that Homer Simpson moment where it's a contrast of their character. But I think it actually says something really important about the father archetype and what the role of the father is, especially in stories, that I want to see if you notice or if you kind of agree with.
Now, unfortunately, YouTube isn't letting us play any of the audio from this scene, but we've left a link in the description in case you wanted to check out this scene in full. But the context is that Goku, in fighting Cell, actually steps aside and gives this fight to his son, who doesn't really think that he's capable of it, but Goku's belief in him convinces him that he's actually able to take on this challenge.
And I love seeing Goku in that king energy here, because it's very much like, I'm going to pull things out of you, because like this is not Goku being selfish of, I don't really want to fight Cell. Everything that you see in his character for the entirety of the series is what is Goku's kind of one-dimensional driver. I want to fight the strongest people. I want to be the person who overcomes, pushes my limits. He sees here in this moment, as much as I could, here's an opportunity for me to give that gift to my son. I'm going to, instead of being selfish and having me push myself beyond my limits to get the victory over this hard opponent, I'm going to give that opportunity for my son to experience that thing that I value. And so it's actually really selfless of him to give Gohan this opportunity rather than him taking it for himself.
It's true.
And there's this cool thing too, where it's like, it's not just about Gohan, but part of what you understand later, Goku's rationale here is that he knows he's not going to be around on Earth forever, and they keep having to face these strong opponents. So not just for Gohan's well-being, but for the well-being of everybody on the planet, like he needs to develop somebody else to take that role, because it can't always be him. So it's this forward-thinking, blessing his community that's really cool to see here.
Yeah. What an interesting and unexpected thing for me to see from Goku.
Right?
Like, I said before, I don't know this show that well. but man, that came out of left field. Makes me feel so good. It's also so interesting for me to see that there's so many parallels in a lot of anime. Like, I don't know if it's something within like Japanese culture or like something about a lot of anime has this idea of, even the idea that Minato said was that the role of a parent is to unconditionally believe in their child.
Well, a parent's duty is to unconditionally believe in their children.
And there's this idea of believing in somebody is so important. You think about how many stories like this, how many video games are like, you know what? The true power came from believing in yourself. It came from your friends all believing in you. It came from the community believing in you and rallying together. Like, there's something about that that's very prevalent within this genre of anime as a whole that's just consistent throughout.
Yeah, there's an interesting, like, I had this experience happen a couple of days ago, even when I was, because I'm doing some training in weightlifting to try to get into a competition, and I was doing some practicing, and I was really struggling with something. I wasn't hitting a weight that I wanted to. I couldn't get it up. And having a coach around who was telling me, like, Curtis, just take a break. Take a second. But come back to it with a little bit of a different idea, different approach. And we're going to do it this way. And then when I step up to the bar, he hasn't been saying anything. But then this time that I approach the bar and I try to put the weight overhead, he's like, all right, Curtis, come on, strong. You got this, right? And wouldn't you know it, whether it was the technical advice or just that idea, like, you can do this, somebody's here supporting you, all of a sudden it kind of unlocks this capacity. And I think that's the thing that I love about this scene with Goku is I think there's something in the role, I don't know if exclusively in Fathers, but certainly at least within Fathers, where as an archetype, there's this idea of part of your job in that king energy is to pull that life force out of your child, which means you are going to need to push them beyond what they believe that they're capable of because of what you see them being capable of. You as the parent, you as the father need to come in and be that thing that mitigates self-doubt. When you see something in your kid that they're capable of, you need to encourage them and believe in them, in this idea of pulling out of them more than they think they have. Because that idea, pulling out more than they think they have, that's growth. That's development. You have because every time that we've been talking about fathers here, I've been thinking about a potted plant. And like the pot that holds the dirt that this seed grows in. The seed has no idea that it is going to become this gigantic plant that is like hundreds of times the size of what the seed originally is. But it's the job of this container to say, like, you can do this. I'm giving you the resources. I'm giving you the support. Now grow, and it'll pull all of that out so that you can go grow beyond what you think. And then there's the reverse when it comes to Vegeta. And if you know Vegeta's character, like Goku's, focuses on pushing himself to be the strongest. Vegeta's character focuses on pride. And I find this scene fascinating because this is where Vegeta sacrifices himself to save everybody else without getting the benefits of, like, Goku's going to get, because he gets to keep his body and all that, because Vegeta has not lived a very noble life. But he's still willing to make this sacrifice. I'm so fascinated by when he's finally willing to make a sacrifice of himself for other people. For the first time in his life, is also the same moment where he opens up to expressing affection towards his son.
Trunks, you are my only son, and yet I haven't held you once since you were a baby, have I? Come here, son.
There's this, like, it almost feels kind of like this king-lover dimension has been opened up, where he's finally able to express affection and do something to the benefit of somebody else rather than living exclusively in warrior.
Yeah. What an interesting exploration of somebody who is 100% warrior venturing into one of those other archetypes.
Yeah, it's again, it's that contrast, right?
You know, in a weird way, it reminds me a little bit of just this one little moment in Vinland Saga at the very beginning when Thors is going off basically to his death.
Yep.
Spoilers.
Yeah.
And he doesn't get to say goodbye to Thorfinn. And so then he tells Helga, like, hey, can you, and he's not able to say, tell him that I love you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an example of a father who's really a good, loving, great dad.
Yep.
But even him, he's so engrossed, even after so long spent away from battle, he's so engrossed in this warrior being that even still, it's so hard for him to say, I love you. And the fact that he's really not able to say it, but tries to, is more powerful than if he just said it. And so in a weird way, that really makes me resonate with the idea that Vegeta didn't say, I love you. He said, I'm proud of you.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, that's the more powerful choice.
Trunks, there's something you must know. You've made me proud, my son.
From a writing perspective, that's such a powerful choice to say more with less in a way.
Well, it's like, I'm going to connect with you, my son, my highest virtue.
Yeah.
My highest virtue is pride.
And
So
in
I'm
my flawed way, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, but this is the best that I can do.
Yeah. In my opinion, I feel like Thors is the greatest dad in all of media. I think from an archetypal standpoint, he is maybe the greatest father that has ever, kind of on that same level as Mufasa.
Yeah.
And I feel like there is one scene that epitomizes that.
もうあんたって子は何でもかんでも放りっぱなしにすんなよなってこら聞いてんの
I love here how the music cuts out.
トルフィ
And kind of like with the Naruto piece, the animation just like...
So detailed. Yeah. The cutting out of the music really draws your focus to say, this is important.
Yeah.
You know what's really cool? Is that him finding this sword came immediately after he just discarded his fake toy sword.
Yeah.
It's this little upgrade. You're going from something that is, no matter how hard you swing, something that can't really do any damage. And he just came from this moment of having broken another kid's arm. But now he's reaching for the thing that actually really can be dangerous.
Yeah, which is, a great point to bring up, because you would think in the warrior idea of being in control of oneself, the fact that he broke another kid's arm when they were play fighting is like, this kid is clearly not in control of his warrior energy.
And he doesn't even have all the resources yet, and he's still causing damage.
Yep. So, and it really is a phenomenal piece of foreshadowing for this entire series of what is going to happen to this kid going forward.
His eyes being opened to the idea of what he can do. That's such a cool image right there.
Oh. 剣が欲しいか、トルフィン。剣は人を殺す道具だ。お前はこれで誰を殺すつもりなんだ。
敵。
お前の敵は誰なんだ。よく聞け、トルフィン。お前に敵などいない。誰にも敵などいないんだ。傷つけて良いものなどどこにもいない。
It's so rich in visual imagery.
Every time it brings up the same emotional resonance in me of like, in the context especially of the first episode, because we get to see who Thors is. Thors is not just a warrior. Thors is the warrior.
Even the name is, it's Thors.
They spend like 7 minutes in the very first episode just on a fight scene to show you how dominant this man is over everybody else. But it's when he has a child, when he brings life into the world, when he starts to access that king energy rather than warrior, where he's like, oh no, I've been doing this all wrong. He starts to see the flaws and completely reshapes his entire perspective on the world, from one being just be the most powerful warrior to now what he is giving his son as a framework, as a lesson, as instruction. And it's not done from a place of like high and mighty self-righteousness. It is done from a place of mistakes. He's like, I'm not telling you not to do this because I think it's wrong. I'm telling you not to do this because I did it and I experienced it being wrong. And there's something beautiful about while he's doing this, he's holding the sword the wrong way. He's not the warrior holding the hilt to injure somebody else. He's the one who's holding it to sacrifice himself, right? Where he's like, I'm going to take on other people's pain rather than putting pain onto other people. And this kind of blanket idea that he says of it seems extreme, but like you have no enemies. And it's this beautiful thesis for the entire, for the show, for the manga that it's from, where like in many ways, this is just the prequel. And the entire story is not Thors, but Thorfinn discovering what his father meant by you have no enemies, and eventually trying to live out that ethos of you have no enemies. And the coolest part is it's around this idea of being a true warrior, right? What does it mean to be a true warrior? And this discovery of it actually doesn't mean what everybody else in the world thinks it means. It doesn't mean injuring others. It doesn't mean having power over others. It means like Thors in the canyon, beautiful articulation visually of it means that while protecting those I care about, I'm also taking care of my enemies, right? That moment of like, how many people have died as this one man runs through 30 of us? None. Excuse me? He's managing to subdue us all without killing a single one of us, right? And it's this cool thing. I love it because it's not naive idealism. This is Thors taking the warrior mentality to its extreme, where it's connected to all the other archetypes. Warrior has finally been connected to king, to magician, and to lover. And he's like, here is this ideal from the lover that I have. You have no enemies. There is no one who it's okay to kill. How am I going to bring that into reality? I'm going to have a warrior powerful enough to make my belief reality. I will manifest the idea that you don't have to kill anybody.
And how powerful is that message coming from the greatest warrior?
Yeah.
How powerful is it? It's one thing if somebody says, I have no enemies, but the person who has slain the most enemies.
Yeah.
To say that you don't need to fight sounds a little bit cheesy until it comes from somebody like Khamzat.
Yeah.
Like that's when it has the most power. I love too how this is the placement of where this is. It's in the dark corner within the chest that you've been kind of hidden away from. It's set up in a way where you can see the visual metaphors of Thorfinn sort of finding this within himself.
Yeah. Discovering in the secret of the shadow.
Yeah. Well, the idea that he's visually doing this when he's playing with the other kids, he's fighting, he's starting to break their arms. It's like this idea where now he's found this treasure chest. He's unlocking the really raw potential of the dangerous power that he actually has.
Yeah.
And that's what Thors is trying to protect him from.
Yeah, the containment of the father.
And it's interesting how that's not just protecting him, it's protecting the people around him as well. Because this is, I'm noticing this, before you reached into that chest and found this sword, you were starting to manifest this darkness in the other people around you, not just within yourself.
Yeah. And that's that real king energy, right? Of like, I'm here to do the best for Thorfinn, but also the best for my community. And my community doesn't just stop in Iceland. My community is everybody. My community is human beings. There is this such a powerful idea where Thors is not taking dominion over humans through power. He's taking dominion as king over all human beings through responsibility and service to them. And that's the reason that I would argue I think he is one of the greatest fathers, because he's taking this archetype and he is saying, I am going to sit here in service and in sacrifice to humanity as a whole, not just my individual community, not my tribe, not my pack, not my family, not just my children, everybody.
And what kind of ties it all together is that you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, but he's not just doing that, but he's doing it from a place of vulnerability.
Yeah.
I've made these mistakes. This is something that I'm not doing because it's the right way. We'll just charge forth. It's like, oh no, this is what I'm doing to people. It's the person that he killed kind of calls out to his wife and child.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this is the consequences of my actions. And that's what drives him to do what he does. From all the ways that you could have structured this character, to do it from a place of weakness and vulnerability really does give everything that he says so much more weight behind it.
It's kind of tragic the way the story kind of continues to unfold, where Thorfinn, I mean, because you've kind of seen and you've gotten to this point in the story now where his dad's words really become something that echo in him moving forward, but he does have to go through a darkness before they really drive home to his heart and he can connect with them.
Yeah.
Like the scene on the boat after Thors has died, where he's going with Askeladd and all the pirates or all the warriors, all the mercenaries. And it's like the look in his eyes is one of the most impactfully animated scenes I've ever seen, where it's like, I don't know how they put pen to paper or you know, stylus to screen, but like to embed this sense of rage that his warrior element is now going to bring forward for the rest of that season is like, it's intense.
That scene in particular, we talked a little bit about show don't tell in terms of filmmaking, but how much does that also come down to being a good father? It's like your kid is going to hear what you say, but man, is he going to really see what you show?
Yeah, what you do. Because Thorfinn doesn't have the same benefit that we do as the audience. He didn't see his dad as a younger man, as that warrior. He hears what his dad says. He doesn't believe him here. But then he watches his dad live out his ethos with complete integrity to the end, where his father is saying, like, my son is somebody who I'm willing to sacrifice for. My people and my community is somebody I'm willing to sacrifice for. And my enemies, or the people who call me an enemy, are someone I'm willing to sacrifice for. And I will show you exactly how that works. And it's this beautiful thing that anchors him. And he drifts for a long time, but it's always there in his soul to come back to at some point.
There's a lot of really good examples that we came across where it's somebody who is either the good example of that, the good king, the Mufasa, or the shadow version of that, the tyrannical king, Scar, or somebody who embodies too much of the warrior, like Vegeta or like Goku. And what I find interesting is that there's also some really interesting examples of characters who kind of like Homer Simpson show a moment of that archetype, of like a good version of that archetype, but really have a lot of flaws. So I'm not sure. Do you remember Treasure Planet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Long John Silver.
Oh, absolutely.
A villain. Like, he's a bad guy. He's not good. And he's got so many flaws. He's got so much wrong with him. But man, does he take on the responsibility of being a good dad to Jim.
There's something cool too about that, right? Where it's like fatherhood can actually be transformative.
Yeah.
Because it's like, he is a bad guy, but when does he start to change? When he is given responsibility over this young man, now this is where he starts to make different choices that are atypical for his character. And so there's this cool, like, yes, it's your responsibility to bring life out of this kid who's had it rough, but you can't do that without having some sort of transformation take place in yourself too.
And it's kind of powerful how it's bittersweet. He doesn't end up good. Like, he doesn't go all the way with that transformation, but Jim is still left with the positive elements of that father role having been filled by him for the short time that it was. For all of his flaws, for all of his weaknesses, he did some good, and he transformed a little bit in himself, but he also did manage to do some good for Jim.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said that you don't have to be perfect.
I think that's a beautiful piece to have there. Yeah, like you, in many ways, you cannot be perfect, but the trying and the striving towards the good, at least being connected to that higher order good, to the benefit of your community, can move you in the right direction.
Don't you get it? I screwed up. I mean, for 2 seconds, I thought that maybe I could do something right, but I just forget it. Forget it.
No, you listen to me, James Hawkins. You got the makings of greatness in you, but you gotta take the helm and charge your own course. Stick to it, no matter the squalls. And when the time comes, you get the chance to really test the cut of your sails and show what you're made of. Well, I hope I'm there, catching some of the light coming off you that day.
You know you're home. You know you're home. Maybe it's the stars in the night. Maybe it's the moon to bring the...
I know you must have mixed feelings about seeing me. But I want you to know, I am so sorry, Uncle. I am so sorry and ashamed of what I did. I don't know how I can ever make it up to you.
All I know is the life you live won't come again.
How can you forgive me so easily? I thought you would be furious with me.
I was never angry with you. I was sad because I was afraid you lost your way.
When you're feeling left alone, with your smiling eyes, but you're dancing in the snow, when you have nowhere to go, you know you're home. You know you're home. You know you're home.
よく聞け、トルフィン。お前に敵などいない。誰にも敵などいないんだ。
If there's any other different types of archetypes, types of characters that you want us to talk about, leave a comment, give us a message, let us know. We'd love to hear from you guys what you want us to explore next.
Thanks so much.
Take care.